"Sir, my son drew you, and he's never seen you before." The rain hit the pavement in sharp, uneven taps, bouncing off the flickering streetlight above the diner's parking lot as Emily Carter stood frozen, her hand still clutching the damp piece of paper her son had insisted she bring. Her apron was still tied at her waist, stained with coffee and grease from a 12-hour shift that hadn't even paid enough to cover next week's rent, and across from her, under the soft glow of a luxury sedan's headlights, stood a man who looked like he belonged in a different world entirely. Jonathan Reed didn't answer right away. He had been reaching for his car door, his tailored coat catching the light just enough to reveal its quiet expense, but now his hand hovered midair, his attention locked on the trembling paper in Emily's grip. She hadn't planned to say anything. Not really. But Ethan had waited outside in the cold for almost 20 minutes, hugging that drawing to his chest like it meant something, like it mattered more than the hunger he hadn't complained about all night, and when she saw the man step out of that exact same car, the one her son had drawn down to the smallest detail, something inside her shifted. "It's probably nothing," she added quickly, her voice soft, almost apologetic, as if she was already regretting stepping into his space. "He's 5. He draws things he imagines." Jonathan's eyes lowered to the page as she finally handed it over, the paper slightly wrinkled, edges curled from the rain. At first glance, it looked like any other child's drawing, uneven lines, bold colors pressed too hard into cheap paper, but then his gaze slowed. The car was unmistakable. Not just the shape, but the details. The custom matte finish. The thin silver line running along the side panel. Even the license plate, personalized, subtle, something only a handful of people had ever seen up close. A quiet breath left him, barely noticeable, but enough. "Where did he see this?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier indifference. Emily shook her head, pushing damp strands of hair behind her ear. "That's the thing, he says he didn't. He just drew it." The rain picked up, louder now, filling the silence between them as Jonathan's thumb brushed lightly over one corner of the page. There was something else. Something he hadn't noticed at first. A small detail, almost hidden. A mark on the figure standing beside the car, a faint line on the wrist. A scar. His jaw tightened. Slowly, almost involuntarily, his gaze dropped to his own hand, where the faint, pale line curved just beneath his sleeve. A scar he'd had for years. One no stranger would ever notice. The air shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough to make the moment feel heavier than it should have been. Emily followed his gaze, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, taking a small step back. "I didn't mean to bother you. It's just," he wouldn't let it go. Inside the diner, through the fogged-up glass, a small figure pressed closer to the window, tiny hands against the surface, watching. Waiting. Jonathan looked up, his eyes meeting the child's for the briefest second. And something about that look, steady, certain, as if the boy had been expecting him all along, made him forget, just for a moment, what he had been about to do. He didn't get back into his car. He didn't look away. Instead, he folded the damp paper carefully, like it mattered more than it should, and asked a question he hadn't planned to ask. "What's your son's name?" "Ethan," Emily said, her voice barely rising above the rain, as if saying his name too loudly might somehow make this moment less real, and Jonathan repeated it silently in his mind, testing the weight of it, before his eyes drifted back to the small figure inside the diner who had not moved, who had not looked away, who simply stood there with a kind of quiet certainty that felt out of place in a child that young. And when Jonathan finally took a step forward, it was not toward his car but toward the door, the soft click of his shoes against the wet pavement sounding louder than it should have, as if the night itself had gone still to listen, and Emily hesitated for only a second before following him, her heart beating faster with each step, not because she expected anything to happen, but because she could not explain why it already felt like something had begun. The bell above the diner door gave a tired ring as they stepped inside, warm air wrapping around them along with the faint scent of coffee and fried food, and Ethan turned immediately, his eyes lighting up not with surprise but with recognition, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment all along, and Jonathan felt something shift again, something subtle but undeniable, as the boy walked straight toward him without hesitation, small sneakers squeaking slightly against the tile floor, stopping just a few feet away as he looked up with an expression that was not shy, not curious, but certain. "You came," Ethan said. His voice soft but steady, and Emily's breath caught as she quickly stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Ethan, do not bother the gentleman," she said quietly, but the boy shook his head, still looking at Jonathan. "He is not a stranger," he added, as if stating something obvious, something that did not need explanation, and Jonathan found himself lowering slightly, not fully kneeling, but enough to meet the child's gaze more directly, his usual composure slipping just enough to reveal something unfamiliar beneath it. "Have we met before?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with something deeper, something searching, and Ethan nodded without hesitation, pointing toward the drawing still in Jonathan's hand. "That night," he said, and Emily frowned, her fingers tightening slightly on his shoulder. "What night, sweetheart?" she asked, but Ethan did not look at her, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. "The night it was raining like this," he said, glancing briefly toward the window where water streaked down the glass. "You stopped your car. You came out. You stood in the rain." Jonathan's chest tightened, a memory flickering at the edge of his mind, something distant, something he had not thought about in a long time, and he shook his head slightly, more to clear the feeling than to deny it. "I think you might be mistaken," he said gently, but Ethan stepped closer, his small hand lifting just enough to point at Jonathan's wrist, at the faint line hidden beneath his sleeve. "You hurt your hand," he said quietly, "but you still smiled, and the air seemed to thin around them." Emily's confusion deepening as she looked between them, her voice softer now, almost uncertain. "Ethan, you have never seen him before," she insisted, but the boy only shook his head again, slower this time, as if the truth was too simple to argue. "He was there," he said, and Jonathan felt something in his chest pull tighter, not pain, not fear, but recognition just out of reach, like a memory waiting to be remembered, and for the first time in a long time, he did not have an answer ready, he did not have control over the moment, he only had the quiet, steady gaze of a child who seemed to know something he did not, and the sound of rain continuing to fall outside, as if it had been falling long before tonight, waiting for him to finally notice. Jonathan did not respond immediately, not because he wanted to ignore the boy, but because something inside him had gone quiet, like a room where a sound had just echoed and had not yet settled, and he slowly straightened, his eyes drifting away from Ethan for just a second as if searching somewhere beyond the diner walls, somewhere deeper than the moment itself, and then it came back, not fully, not clearly, but enough to make his breath shift, a faint memory pressing at the edge of his mind. Rain against glass, headlights cutting through darkness, a figure standing alone on the side of the road, and the sharp sting of his own hand as he had stepped out into the storm without thinking, without asking why, only knowing that he could not drive past. "There was a night," he said slowly, more to himself than to them, his voice quieter now, less certain, and Emily watched him carefully, her confusion turning into something else, something cautious, something protective, as she gently guided Ethan a step back, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," she began, her tone polite but guarded, "I do not want my son getting his hopes up about something that is not real," and Jonathan looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time, noticing the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her fingers curled slightly as if always bracing for something to go wrong, the quiet strength in the way she stood between him and her child without even realizing it. "I understand," he said, and there was no edge in his voice now, only a calm steadiness that felt different from before. "I am not trying to suggest anything," but his gaze dropped again to the drawing, to that small, impossible detail that refused to be ignored, and Ethan stepped forward again before his mother could stop him, his voice softer this time, almost like he was remembering something instead of explaining it. "You gave her your jacket," he said, and Jonathan's chest tightened instantly, the memory sharpening just enough to take shape. A woman sitting on the curb, her shoulders shaking from the cold, a small figure beside her wrapped in something too thin for the weather, and without thinking, he had taken off his coat, draped it over her, and told her it would be all right. even though he had not known her name, even though he had not stayed long enough to learn it. "Ethan," Emily whispered, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with something deeper, something she had not let herself revisit in years, and Jonathan's eyes lifted slowly, meeting hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because the space between them was no longer just a diner floor but a memory. Neither of them had expected to share. "That night," Emily said quietly, almost to herself, "my car broke down 3 blocks from here," her voice steady but distant, as if she was walking back through every second. "It was freezing, and I had no signal, no way to call anyone." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly on Ethan's shoulder, "and someone stopped," she added, looking at Jonathan now with a new kind of awareness, not certainty. Not yet, but something close to it, just for a few minutes. Jonathan did not interrupt, did not confirm, but the way he held her gaze was enough, and Ethan smiled faintly, as if the pieces had already come together in his mind long before the adults had caught up. "I told you," he said softly, and the rain outside continued to fall, steady and unbroken, as if it had carried that night forward into this one, waiting for them to finally see it clearly. Emily did not move right away, not even when the bell above the diner door rang softly behind another customer entering, because something in the air had changed, something quiet but undeniable, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for years and had finally found its way back, and she looked at Jonathan not as a stranger anymore, but as someone tied to a moment she had once convinced herself was just luck, just a passing kindness in a world that rarely slowed down long enough to notice people like her. "You left before I could even thank you," she said, her voice steady but softer now, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile connection forming between them, and Jonathan exhaled slowly, his hand still holding the folded drawing, his thumb resting over the faint lines that had somehow carried a memory across time without him realizing it. "I did not think it mattered," he admitted, and there was something different in his tone now, something less certain, less distant than before. "I saw someone who needed help, so I stopped," and Ethan watched both of them closely, his small face calm, almost thoughtful, as if he had already understood something the adults were only beginning to see. "You said it would be okay," the boy added quietly, and Jonathan's gaze shifted back to him, a faint crease forming between his brows. "I say that to a lot of people," he replied gently, but Ethan shook his head, stepping just a little closer. "No," he said, his voice certain again, "you meant it," and for a moment, Jonathan did not know how to respond, because the boy was right, that night had not been routine, it had not been just another stop along a long drive home, it had stayed with him in a way he had never quite explained, even if he had buried it under meetings and numbers and decisions that filled every hour of his life. Emily glanced down at her son, then back at Jonathan, her expression shifting as realization slowly settled in, not just about that night, but about everything that had come after it. "He was sick," she said quietly, her voice carrying a memory she had not spoken out loud in years. "Ethan had a fever, and I was trying to get him home before it got worse, but the car just stopped." She paused, her fingers brushing lightly through her son's hair, "and then you showed up." Jonathan listened without interrupting, his posture still, his attention focused in a way that felt unfamiliar even to himself, as if this moment demanded something more than the surface-level responses he was used to giving, and Emily continued, her voice steady but filled with something deeper now. "You gave me your jacket, and you told me to wait in your car while you called for help." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "But you never told me your name." Jonathan let out a quiet breath, almost a half-smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "I usually do not," he said, and there was no pride in it, just fact, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying him in that same quiet, certain way. "I remembered," he said softly, "because you were the only one who stopped," and the simplicity of that statement settled heavily in the space between them, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, and Jonathan felt something shift again, something deeper this time, something that had nothing to do with business or control or distance, but everything to do with a single moment that had mattered more than he had ever allowed himself to realize. And outside, the rain began to slow, the steady rhythm softening against the glass as if the night itself was beginning to let go of something it had been holding on to for far too long. Jonathan did not realize he was still holding the drawing until his fingers tightened slightly around the paper, as if letting go of it might cause the moment to slip away, and he looked down at it again, not as a curiosity this time, but as something that had carried a truth back to him, something simple and quiet that he had once done without expecting anything in return, and yet here it was, years later, standing in front of him in the form of a child who had not forgotten, as should have. "Stayed," he said finally, the words coming slower than he expected, as if they had been waiting beneath the surface for a long time, and Emily's expression softened just a fraction, not because she needed an apology, but because she recognized the sincerity behind it. "You helped more than enough," she replied gently, her voice steady in a way that came from experience, from learning not to expect more than what was given. Most people would have driven past, and Jonathan gave a small nod, but something in his gaze suggested he was still somewhere else, still replaying that night in a way he had never allowed himself to before. Ethan stepped closer again, his small hand resting lightly against the edge of the table as he looked up at Jonathan with that same quiet certainty. "Mom said you were busy," he said, his tone thoughtful rather than accusing. "That is why you left," and Jonathan almost smiled at that, not because it was entirely true, but because it was the kind of explanation a child would accept, the kind that made sense without needing to question it too deeply. "Something like that," he answered, though his voice carried a hint of something unspoken, something heavier than the words themselves. Emily glanced toward the window, noticing the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the street outside reflecting the dim glow of passing headlights, and for a moment she seemed to consider something, weighing it carefully before speaking again. "After that night," she said quietly, her eyes returning to Jonathan, "everything changed for us," and he looked at her, his attention sharpening, not out of obligation, but out of something more personal now, something that had begun to take root. "The tow truck came faster than it should have," she continued, a faint, almost disbelieving smile touching her lips, "and the driver said someone had already paid for it." Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly, his memory shifting again, connecting pieces he had not thought about in years. "I made a call," he admitted, almost absent-mindedly, as if it had been such a small action at the time that it barely registered, but Emily shook her head softly. "It was more than that," she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "They fixed the car, and the next morning, someone called me about a job opening at a place I had applied to months before." She paused, her gaze steady on him now. "They said my application had been reviewed again." Jonathan blinked once, slowly, the pieces aligning in a way he had not expected, small decisions made without thought, without intention, creating something far larger than he had ever seen, and Ethan looked between them, his expression calm, as if none of this surprised him at all. "I told you," he said softly, he meant it, and Jonathan exhaled quietly, the weight of that simple truth settling deeper than he was prepared for, because for the first time in a long time, he was not being recognized for what he owned or what he controlled, but for something far quieter, something he had almost forgotten he was capable of. And as he looked at Emily and Ethan standing there, he realized that whatever had begun that night had not ended when he drove away, it had simply been waiting for him to come back and see it clearly. Jonathan remained still for a moment longer, the quiet weight of everything settling deeper than he was used to allowing, and for once, he did not rush to move past it, did not reach for his phone or check the time or think about the next obligation waiting for him beyond the diner doors, because something about this moment refused to be reduced to a schedule, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different kind of presence, something less controlled, more intentional. "Where do you live?" he asked, not out of curiosity, but with a quiet purpose that made Emily hesitate, her instincts rising immediately, shaped by years of learning to question help that came too easily, too unexpectedly, and she shifted slightly, her hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder again. "Not far," she answered carefully, her tone polite but measured, and Jonathan nodded once, as if he understood exactly what she was not saying, the caution, the need to protect what little stability she had built, and he did not push, did not step closer, did not try to close the distance that still existed between them. Instead, he placed the folded drawing gently on the table, smoothing it once with his palm as if returning something important, something that did not belong to him. "I have a car outside," he said calmly, "and it is still raining, even if only a little." His gaze shifted briefly toward the window, then back to her. "Let me drive you home." Emily opened her mouth to respond, the automatic refusal already forming, but it paused, caught somewhere between habit and the quiet truth that she was tired, more tired than she had let herself admit, and Ethan looked up at her, not pleading, not insisting, just watching, trusting her decision, and that made it harder, not easier, because she could not hide behind excuses when her son was simply waiting for her to choose. "We can take the bus," she said finally, though the words lacked their usual certainty, and Jonathan did not argue, did not contradict her. He only gave a small nod, acknowledging her choice without judgment, and for a moment it seemed like the conversation would end there, like the moment would gently fade into something ordinary again. But then Ethan reached for the drawing, holding it carefully in both hands before looking up at Jonathan once more. "You said it would be okay," he repeated softly, not as a question, not as a demand, but as a simple reminder. And something in that quiet voice shifted the balance just enough. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering a fraction as she looked from her son to Jonathan, and this time when she spoke, her voice was still cautious, still careful, but no longer closed. "It is only a few miles," she said, almost as if she was negotiating with herself as much as with him, and Jonathan gave a faint, understanding nod, stepping back slightly, creating space rather than taking it. "Then I will drive you a few miles," he replied simply, and there was no pressure in it, no expectation, just an offer that stood on its own, and Emily hesitated for one more second before giving a small nod, not fully trusting, not fully certain, but willing, just enough. And as they moved toward the door together, the bell ringing softly above them once again, the night outside felt different, quieter, as if something had shifted not just between them, but within the space they were stepping into. And Jonathan reached for the door, holding it open without a word as Emily guided Ethan through first, the cool air brushing against them as they stepped outside, and for the first time that evening, the distance between their worlds did not feel quite as wide as it had before. The rain had softened into a thin mist by the time they reached the car, the streetlights reflecting in long golden lines across the wet pavement, and Emily hesitated just a fraction before opening the passenger door, her movements careful, measured, as if stepping into something unfamiliar, while Ethan climbed in beside her without a second thought, his small hand still holding the drawing like it belonged to the moment more than anything else. And Jonathan circled to the driver's side, the quiet click of the door closing sealing them into a space that felt strangely still compared to the world outside. For a moment, no one spoke, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence as Jonathan adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting Ethan's reflection, and the boy simply smiled, not wide or excited, just a calm, knowing expression that made Jonathan look away sooner than he expected. "You can tell me where to go," he said, his voice steady as he eased the car onto the road, and Emily nodded, giving him directions in short, simple terms, each one bringing them farther from the bright lights of downtown and deeper into quieter streets where the buildings grew smaller, older, more worn, and Jonathan noticed everything without meaning to, the flickering porch lights, the narrow sidewalks, the way the road dipped slightly where water had gathered in shallow pools. "You do not have to drive fast," Ethan said suddenly from the back seat, his voice soft but clear, and Jonathan glanced at him in the mirror, a faint crease forming between his brows. "I am not in a hurry," he replied, easing his foot slightly off the gas without realizing it, and Emily let out a small breath beside him, not quite a laugh, but something close to it, something that carried a hint of relief. "He says things like that," she murmured, almost apologetically, but Jonathan shook his head once, his eyes still on the road. "It is fine," he said, and there was something genuine in the way he said it, something that made the silence that followed feel less like distance and more like space. The car turned onto a narrower street, the pavement rougher now, lined with modest houses that leaned slightly with age, and Emily pointed ahead. "Just up there," she said, her voice quieter now, and Jonathan slowed as he approached a small building with chipped paint and a single dim light above the entrance, the kind of place that blended into the background of the city, unnoticed by anyone who did not need to see it. He parked the car and turned off the engine, the sudden quiet settling around them again, and for a moment, no one moved, as if stepping out would end something that had not yet fully taken shape. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his small hand resting against the back of Jonathan's seat. "You found us again," he said softly, and Jonathan's grip tightened just a fraction on the steering wheel. Not from discomfort, but from the weight of those simple words, and Emily opened her door, the cool night air slipping in as she stepped out, her movements slower now, more thoughtful, as if she was aware that this moment mattered in a way she could not yet define. Jonathan followed, stepping out into the quiet street as he looked up at the building, then back at Emily and Ethan standing near the entrance, and something about the way they waited, not asking, not expecting, just there, made him realize that this was not just a drive, not just a favor, it was a continuation of something he had started without knowing it, and as Ethan reached for his mother's hand, still holding the drawing in the other, the night felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but neither of them could walk away from anymore. Emily reached for the door handle, her fingers brushing against the worn metal as she paused for just a moment longer, not because she was unsure of going inside, but because something in her chest felt unfamiliar, a quiet hesitation that came from realizing this night had not unfolded the way she had expected it to, and she turned slightly, looking back at Jonathan who still stood a few steps behind, his posture composed as always, but his eyes no longer distant, no longer detached, instead focused in a way that suggested he was seeing more than just the building in front of him. "Thank you," she said softly, the word simple, but carrying more weight than she intended, because this was not just about the ride, not just about the past, it was about something she could not yet define, and Jonathan gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged the gratitude without diminishing it, but he did not move to leave, did not turn back toward his car, and Ethan noticed immediately, his small hand slipping free from his mother's as he stepped closer to Jonathan again, looking up at him with that same steady expression. "You are going to come back," the boy said, not asking, not guessing, just stating it as if it had already happened, and Emily let out a quiet breath, shaking her head slightly. "Ethan," she murmured, a gentle warning in her voice, but Jonathan's gaze remained on the child, thoughtful, considering, and for a moment, he did not answer right away, because the truth was not as simple as a yes or no, not when he felt something pulling at him in a way he had not expected. "I do not usually return to places," he said finally, his voice calm, but there was a pause after it, a space where something unspoken lingered, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying him as if that answer did not quite fit. "But you found us again," he replied softly, and Jonathan exhaled quietly, a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close to it, something warmer than before. "Yes," he admitted, and this time the word carried a different meaning, something less about coincidence and more about choice. Emily watched the exchange, something inside her loosening just enough to let a small, uncertain hope surface, though she quickly pushed it back, grounding herself in what she knew, in what she had learned to rely on, and she reached for Ethan's hand again, guiding him gently toward the entrance. "It is late," she said, her voice steady once more. "We should go inside," and Ethan nodded, but not before looking back at Jonathan one more time, as if making sure the moment would not disappear when the door closed. Jonathan remained where he was, the cool night air settling around him as he watched them step toward the building, the faint creak of the door echoing softly as Emily opened it, and just before they disappeared inside, she turned back once more, her eyes meeting his in a quiet exchange that did not need words, something unspoken but understood, and then the door closed, leaving him alone on the dimly lit street. For a moment, he did not move, his hand resting loosely at his side, his mind not on the meetings waiting for him tomorrow, not on the decisions that usually filled his thoughts, but on a small boy who had remembered him when he had forgotten himself, and a woman who had carried forward a kindness he had never stopped to measure. And as the last drops of rain fell softly against the pavement, Jonathan finally turned, but instead of walking straight back to his car, he glanced once more at the building, as if committing it to memory this time, not as a place he had passed, but as a place he might return to, because for the first time in a long time, leaving did not feel like the end of something, it felt like a question he had not yet answered. Jonathan did not start the engine right away, even after he had returned to the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as his eyes lingered on the building in front of him, the single dim light above the entrance casting a faint glow that seemed far too small to hold the weight of everything that had just happened, and for the first time in years, he allowed the silence to stretch without interruption, without filling it with calls or decisions or the constant motion that had defined his life. Instead, he sat there, replaying the details he had overlooked before, the rain, the roadside, the small figure he had barely noticed at the time, and the way that moment had followed him back without him realizing it, shaping something beyond his control. A soft vibration broke through the stillness as his phone lit up on the console, the screen flashing with a name that usually demanded immediate attention. But he did not reach for it right away, not this time, and When he finally glanced at it, the urgency that once felt automatic now seemed distant, almost irrelevant compared to the quiet clarity settling in his mind. He declined the call with a simple motion and leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to the building as if confirming it was still there, still real, not just a passing moment that would disappear once he drove away. Inside, behind one of the dimly lit windows, a faint movement caught his attention, and though he could not see clearly, he knew it was them, Emily guiding Ethan through their small space, the kind of routine that held a different kind of importance, something steady, something grounded, and he realized how unfamiliar that rhythm was to him, how distant it had become. His hand moved almost instinctively, reaching for the folded drawing resting beside him, and he opened it again, smoothing out the edges carefully, his eyes tracing the uneven lines, the details that no child should have known, and yet had captured. With a certainty that could not be dismissed, the car, the rain, the figure. And that small, precise mark on the wrist, a detail that made something tighten in his chest all over again, because it meant the moment had mattered, not just to them, but to him as well, even if he had not recognized it at the time. He folded the paper once more, slower this time, more deliberate, and placed it back on the seat beside him, not as something to be forgotten, but as something to be kept. Something that now carried a meaning he could not ignore. The engine finally came to life. With a quiet hum, but he did not pull away immediately, his eyes lifting once more to the building, to that single light, and for a brief moment, he considered something he rarely allowed himself to consider, not a decision, not a plan, but a possibility, the kind that did not fit into schedules or expectations, the kind that could not be controlled or predicted, only chosen. And as he finally eased the car away from the curb, the street stretching out ahead of him, he did not feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was carrying it with him, something quiet, something unfinished, something that had begun long before tonight and was now asking, in the simplest way possible, whether he was willing to see it through to the end. The city looked different to Jonathan that night, not because anything had changed, but because for the first time in years, he was not looking past it, not treating it as something to move through on the way to somewhere more important. And as the car moved through the quiet streets, past closed storefronts and dim apartment windows, his mind stayed fixed on a single place, a single moment that refused to fade the way everything else usually did. By the time he reached his building, the contrast felt sharper than it ever had before, the polished glass exterior reflecting the city lights in perfect symmetry, the lobby bright and silent as he stepped inside, greeted by the familiar nod of the night concierge who had seen him pass through countless times without ever truly stopping, and Jonathan returned the gesture absently, his thoughts still elsewhere as he crossed the marble floor, the echo of his footsteps too clean, too controlled compared to the uneven rhythm of rain against pavement he had left behind. The elevator ride was quiet, smooth, efficient, carrying him upward without pause, and as the doors opened to his penthouse, the space greeted him exactly as it always did, immaculate, precise, untouched by anything unexpected, and yet something about it felt different now, not wrong, not uncomfortable, but distant, like a place that no longer held the same meaning it once did. He set his keys down on the counter with a soft click, the sound echoing slightly in the open space. And for a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the stillness, the absence of anything unplanned, and it struck him how complete the contrast was, how everything in this space existed exactly as it was designed to, while just a few miles away, life unfolded without that control, without that certainty, and somehow felt more real because of it. His phone buzzed again, more insistent this time, and he picked it up, glancing at the messages that had accumulated, updates, questions, decisions. Waiting for his approval, the usual demands that filled his days, but instead of responding immediately, he set the phone back down, the screen going dark as he turned away from it, walking slowly toward the window that overlooked the city. The view was expansive, uninterrupted, the light stretching endlessly into the distance, and normally it grounded him, reminded him of everything he had built, everything he managed. But tonight, his reflection in the glass felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because he was seeing it differently, seeing the space between what he controlled and what he had overlooked. His hand moved to his pocket almost without thought, retrieving the folded drawing once more, and he opened it carefully, placing it against the glass as if comparing two worlds, the simple lines of a child's memory against the structured order of the city below, and the contrast was quiet but undeniable. He traced the edge of the drawing with his fingers, stopping again at the small detail on the wrist, and this time, instead of questioning it, he accepted it for what it was, a reminder, not of something extraordinary, but of something simple that had mattered more than he had realized. The room remained silent around him, the city continuing its distant rhythm below, but inside that stillness, a decision began to take shape, not loud, not immediate, but steady, like something that had been forming long before he allowed himself to notice it, and as he folded the drawing once more, placing it carefully on the table instead of putting it away, Jonathan understood that tomorrow would not follow the same pattern it always had, because for the first time in a long time, he was not planning his next move based on what he controlled, but on something far quieter, something he had almost forgotten how to choose. Morning arrived without the usual urgency, the sunlight slipping quietly through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Jonathan stood in the same place he had been the night before, the city stretching out below him in its usual rhythm, but something about the way he observed it had changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough to make him pause instead of move, to consider instead of react. And when his phone began to vibrate on the counter, persistent and familiar, he let it ring for a moment longer than he normally would before finally reaching for it, his expression calm as he answered, his voice steady but lacking its usual sharp edge. "Reschedule the morning meetings," he said simply, cutting through the greeting on the other end, and there was a brief silence before the assistant responded, surprised but professional. "All of them?" she asked. And Jonathan glanced toward the table where the folded drawing rested, the paper catching the light in a way that seemed too simple for the weight it carried. "Yes," he replied, without hesitation this time. "Move them to the afternoon," and before any further questions could follow, he ended the call, placing the phone down with a quiet certainty that felt unfamiliar, not because the decision was difficult, but because it was different from what he would have chosen before. He moved through the apartment with a deliberate pace, not rushed, not distracted, selecting a coat that was practical rather than tailored, something he rarely considered, and as he stepped out into the hallway, the silence of the building greeted him in the same polished way it always did, but he did not linger, did not let it pull him back into routine, instead continuing forward with a clarity that had settled overnight. The drive felt shorter this time, not because the distance had changed, but because his focus had, the streets more familiar, the turns more intentional, and when he reached the neighborhood, he slowed naturally, his eyes scanning the same row of modest buildings, the same worn sidewalks, until he found the one he had memorized without realizing it, the same dim light now replaced by the softer glow of morning. He parked the car and stepped out, the air cooler, quieter, carrying the faint sounds of a day just beginning. And for a moment, he stood there again, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, understanding that crossing this distance once had been coincidence, but coming back was something else entirely. Inside, Emily moved through her small kitchen, the routine of the morning grounding her, coffee brewing, a simple breakfast laid out, Ethan sitting at the table with the same drawing in front of him, adding small lines with careful focus as if the image was not yet complete. And when the knock came at the door, it was soft, measured, almost hesitant, and Emily paused, her hand stilling for a fraction of a second before she walked toward it, not expecting anything unusual, not expecting him, and when she opened it, the surprise was quiet but unmistakable, her eyes widening just slightly as she took in the sight of Jonathan standing there in the morning light. No rain, no urgency, just presence. Neither of them spoke right away, because the moment did not demand explanation, it only asked to be acknowledged, and Jonathan gave a small nod, the same calm steadiness in his expression, but now without distance, without the barrier that had existed before. "Good morning," he said simply, and inside, Ethan looked up from the table, his face lighting with a quiet recognition that carried no surprise at all, as if this return had always been part of the story he had already drawn. Emily did not step aside immediately, not because she wanted to close the door, but because she needed a moment to understand what this meant, not just that he had returned, but that he had chosen to, and that choice carried a weight she had learned not to expect from people who lived in a world so far removed from her own, and Jonathan seemed to understand that pause without needing it explained. His posture relaxed, his hands at his sides, not imposing, not rushing the moment. Simply present in a way that felt unfamiliar yet steady. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said, his voice calm, and Emily shook her head slightly, stepping back just enough to open the space between them. "No," she replied quietly, her tone still careful but no longer guarded in the same way, "we were just having breakfast," and as he stepped inside, the difference between his world and hers became even more visible, not through anything dramatic, but through the small details, the worn edges of the table, the mismatched chairs, the faint hum of an old refrigerator, everything simple, everything real, and Jonathan took it in without comment, without judgment, as if he was seeing something he had not allowed himself to notice before. Ethan looked up from his seat, his face lighting with that same calm certainty, and he held up the drawing, now with a few more lines added. "I fixed it," he said, as if the picture had needed correcting, and Jonathan stepped closer, lowering slightly to look at it, his attention focused not just on the image, but on the care the boy had taken, the intention behind every small detail. "What did you fix?" Jonathan asked, his voice softer now, and Ethan pointed to a small addition near the edge of the drawing, a second figure standing slightly behind the first, drawn with lighter lines, almost like a memory trying to become clearer. "That is Mom," he said simply. "You were not alone," and Emily felt something tighten gently in her chest, not discomfort, not fear, but recognition. Because the boy had drawn something she had not even spoken out loud, something she had kept quiet, believing it was just her own memory, her own version of that night. Jonathan studied the drawing for a moment longer, his eyes tracing the new detail, and then he nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he had not fully understood before. "You are right," he said quietly, and the simplicity of that agreement carried more meaning than explanation ever could. Emily moved toward the counter, pouring coffee into a third cup without thinking. The motion natural, almost automatic, and she hesitated for a brief second before setting it on the table, not as an obligation, not as a gesture she felt she had to make, but as something she chose, something small that acknowledged his presence in their space, and Jonathan noticed, not the action itself, but the intention behind it, and he took a seat when she gestured lightly toward the chair, the distance between them no longer defined by where they stood, but by what they were willing to share. "I came back," he said after a moment, his voice steady, not to explain, but to state something that needed to be said, and Emily met his gaze, her expression thoughtful, searching. "I can see that," she replied softly, and there was no accusation in her tone, no expectation, just an acknowledgement of the choice he had made. The room settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that did not demand conversation, only presence, and as Ethan returned to his drawing, adding small details with careful focus, Jonathan realized that this moment, simple as it was, held something he had not experienced in a long time, not control, not obligation, but connection, something built not on what he could offer, but on what he was willing to understand. And as the morning light filled the small space, it became clear that what had begun as a single moment in the rain had grown into something neither of them had planned, but both of them were now quietly choosing to continue. The morning light settled gently across the small apartment, filling the space in a way that made everything feel quieter, softer, as if time itself had slowed just enough to let the moment breathe, and Jonathan sat at the table with his hands loosely around the warm cup of coffee, not because he needed it, but because it gave him something simple to hold on to while everything else shifted in ways he had not expected. And across from him, Emily moved through the space with a quiet familiarity. Clearing plates, wiping the table, her movement steady and unhurried, not performing for him, not trying to impress, just living in a rhythm she had built on her own. Ethan remained focused on his drawing, adding one final line before looking up, his expression calm, certain, as if he had already reached the end of something important, and he slid the paper gently across the table toward Jonathan. "It is finished now," he said softly, and Jonathan looked down at it, really looked this time, seeing not just the shapes or the details, but the intention behind it, the way the three figures now stood together in the same space, not perfectly drawn, not precise, but connected in a way that did not need explanation. Emily paused for a moment, her gaze following the drawing, and something in her expression softened, not because everything had suddenly changed, but because something had been acknowledged, something that had existed quietly beneath the surface for a long time. Jonathan reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the paper before he folded it carefully, slower than before, more deliberate, and instead of placing it aside, he held on to it, as if it belonged with him now, not as a reminder of the past, but as something that had carried him into the present. "I do not usually keep things like this," he said quietly, more to himself than to them, and Ethan smiled faintly. "You should," he replied. And there was no insistence in his voice, only a simple truth, and Jonathan gave a small nod, accepting it without resistance. Emily stepped closer, resting her hand lightly against the back of the chair, her gaze steady on Jonathan. "You have already done more than enough," she said, her voice calm, not pushing him away, but setting a boundary shaped by experience, by the understanding that kindness did not always stay, that moments like this could fade if they were held too tightly. And Jonathan looked up at her, his expression clear, not distant, not uncertain, but grounded in a way that felt new even to him. "I know," he replied, and there was no argument in his tone, only acknowledgement. "But this is not about what I have done," he added after a brief pause, "it is about what I choose to do next." And the words settled quietly between them, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, searching, not for promises, not for guarantees, but for something simpler, something real, and whatever she saw there made her nod once, a small, measured acceptance, not of him entirely, not yet, but of the possibility he represented. Ethan stood up from his chair, stepping closer to Jonathan without hesitation, his small hand reaching out as if the distance between them no longer needed to exist, and Jonathan responded instinctively, not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with a quiet understanding. Meeting the gesture without question, outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, unaware of the small shift that had taken place within these walls, but inside, something had been set in motion, something that did not need to be rushed or defined, only continued, one choice at a time. And as Jonathan stood to leave, the folded drawing held carefully in his hand, he paused at the door for just a moment, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this time, walking away did not mean leaving something behind, it meant carrying it forward. And when he finally stepped out into the morning light, the air felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had, even if only in the quietest, most important way. And somewhere behind him, in a small apartment filled with simple things, a child's drawing had done what money never could. It had reminded him who he was before he forgot how to